Empty cities stand silent where thousands once lived. Great monuments are all that remain of powerful empires. History is filled with cultures that achieved incredible heights, only to vanish without a clear explanation. Their stories are not just footnotes, they are profound mysteries that challenge our understanding of human achievement and fragility. By the end of this journey, you will explore 30 of these lost worlds and the leading theories behind their stunning disappearances. We will walk the abandoned streets of a civilization that mastered urban planning 4,000 years ago and puzzle over a society that ritually burned its own cities to the ground. What common thread do you think connects these great vanishings? Our journey begins with a civilization so advanced, its cities would not be matched for over 1,000 years. In the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, the Indus Valley civilization flourished from around 3,300 BCE. This was not a collection of simple villages, it was a vast, interconnected urban network, home to perhaps 5 million people at its peak. Their cities, like the famous Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of planning. Streets were laid out in precise grids. Homes featured indoor plumbing and sophisticated drainage systems that channeled waste away from living areas. They used standardized weights and measures for trade across a region larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and they left behind thousands of inscribed seals bearing a unique script that to this day no one has been able to read. Their writing remains a silent language holding their stories captive. Then, around 1900 BCE, something went terribly wrong. The great cities did not fall in a dramatic conquest. They were slowly, systematically abandoned. People left their well-built homes, their public baths, their granaries. Over centuries, the population dwindled, the urban centers emptied, and a vibrant culture faded into the dust. What could cause such a meticulous society to simply walk away from everything it had built? Scholars have proposed several theories, but each comes with its own questions. One leading idea points to climate change. Evidence suggests the mighty Gaga-Hakra river system, the lifeblood of the civilization, began to dry up or change course. This would have devastated agriculture, the foundation of their urban life. Another theory suggests a series of catastrophic floods could have repeatedly damaged the cities, making them unsustainable. There is also the old idea of an invasion by nomadic peoples from the north, but archaeological evidence for widespread violent conflict is surprisingly scant. The cities show little signs of large-scale burning or battle. The decline appears more as a slow unraveling than a sudden catastrophe. Perhaps the true answer is a combination of factors. Environmental stress may have weakened the society, making it vulnerable to smaller disruptions in trade or social order. The centralized systems that made them so successful may have become rigid, unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Whatever the cause, the result is a haunting emptiness. The Indus Valley people left their magnificent cities intact, but they left no monuments to kings, no clear temples to gods, and no deciphered records to tell us why they departed. Their disappearance is a quiet, profound mystery. It asks us how even the most advanced and orderly societies can reach a tipping point and then simply fade from history, leaving behind only the echoes of their ingenuity in silent, buried streets. From the silent, orderly streets of the Indus, we travel west to a culture defined by color, movement, and myth. On the sun-drenched island of Crete, the Minoan civilization thrived, a society so vibrant it inspired the legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. Their world centered on magnificent palace complexes, the greatest being the sprawling palace of Knossos with its labyrinthine corridors and vivid frescoes. These paintings show a people in love with life, depicting graceful athletes leaping over bulls, elegant women in elaborate gowns, and dolphins dancing in blue seas. The Minoans were master sailors, their ships dominating Mediterranean trade routes, bringing in treasures and ideas from Egypt and the Near East. Remarkably, their cities and palaces lacked massive defensive walls, suggesting a period of remarkable security and confidence, a rare piece in the ancient world. Then, around 1600 BCE, a cataclysm erupted just 70 miles to the north. The volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, exploded in one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The eruption was unimaginable, blasting cubic miles of rock and ash into the sky. It would have been followed by towering tsunamis, waves perhaps 100 feet high, crashing into the northern coasts of Crete. A thick blanket of volcanic ash would have smothered farmland, crippling agriculture for years. The direct damage from these events must have been devastating. But did this natural disaster single-handedly erase the Minoans? The archaeological record suggests a more complex story. While many coastal settlements were severely damaged or abandoned, the Great Palace at Knossos was not immediately destroyed. It shows signs of repair and continued use for perhaps another century. This has led to a fascinating debate. One school of thought argues the eruption was a death blow, shattering their maritime trade network and causing irreversible economic and environmental collapse. Another theory proposes the disaster fatally weakened the Minoans, leaving them vulnerable. Within a few generations, the Palace of Knossos shows a shift in artifacts and writing, indicating it was taken over by the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. The Minoan culture, its unique language and art, faded away, absorbed by a new power. So did they fall by fire from the sky or by the sword from the sea? The answer may be both. The eruption likely broke the backbone of their society, and in that vulnerable state, conquest delivered the final blow. The Minoans left behind no deciphered linear script to tell their own story, only beautiful, haunting images of a world that vanished in smoke and ash, its peace shattered by the fury of the earth itself. The collapse of the Minoans created a power vacuum, and from the rugged mainland of Greece, a new culture rose to dominate the Aegean. These were the Mycenaeans, a civilization of warrior kings whose legendary exploits would later inspire Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Their world was one of formidable power, centered not on open, artistic palaces, but on heavily fortified citadels built atop hills. Places like Mycenae, with its famous Lion Gate, and Turin's, with walls so massive later Greeks believed they were built by giants, projected an image of grim strength. Inside these fortresses, scribes used a script called Linear B, which we now know was an early form of Greek, to record inventories of weapons, chariots, and agricultural stores. Their society was organized for war and wealth, controlling a vast trade network that stretched from Italy to Egypt and the Levant. For centuries, they were the preeminent power in the region. Then, with shocking speed around 1200 BCE, it all came crashing down. Within a single generation, every major Mycenaean palace center was violently destroyed by fire and systematically abandoned. The writing of Linear B ceased entirely. This was not an isolated event, but part of a wider cataclysm historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a period that saw the fall of the Hittite Empire, the decline of New Kingdom Egypt, and the destruction of cities from Troy to Ugarit. The sophisticated international system of the late Bronze Age simply disintegrated, plunging the Eastern Mediterranean into a 300-year period often called the Greek Dark Ages, where literacy vanished and society reverted to smaller, simpler villages. So what apocalyptic force could topple so many mighty kingdoms at once? The mystery has fueled debate for over a century. Ancient Egyptian records speak of invading confederations known only as the Sea Peoples, marauders who attacked by ship and by land. But were they a cause of the collapse or a symptom of it, displaced populations themselves fleeing some greater disaster? Other theories point to a perfect storm of crises. A prolonged, severe drought could have triggered famine, social unrest, and the breakdown of the complex trade routes that these palace economies depended upon. There is also evidence of devastating earthquakes in the region during this period. Perhaps the most compelling idea is a combination of all these factors. Environmental stress may have led to food shortages and internal rebellions, weakening kingdoms from within just as external threats, whether human or seismic, arrived to deliver the final blow. The fortified walls of Mycenae, built to withstand armies, could not protect against a collapsing global system. The fall of the Mycenaeans is a stark reminder of how interconnected and fragile ancient civilizations could be, where the failure of one link could unravel an entire world, leaving behind only echoes of glory in epic poems and the silent, fire-scarred stones of forgotten citadels. Across the ocean, in the lush tropical lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, another foundational culture rose from the jungle. The Olmecs, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, laid the groundwork for everything that would follow, from the Maya to the Aztecs. Their society emerged as early as 1600 BCE, making them one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas. They are most famous for their staggering colossal heads, 17 of which have been discovered. These monumental sculptures, carved from single blocks of basalt that weighed up to 20 tons, depict helmeted individuals with distinct, powerful features. The sheer effort of transporting these stones from quarries dozens of miles away, without the wheel or draft animals, speaks to a highly organized and ambitious society. But their legacy is far more than stone. The Olmecs developed a ritual ball game that would become a cornerstone of Mesoamerican culture for millennia, a sport with profound religious and political significance. They carved intricate jade figurines, built large ceremonial centers with massive earthen pyramids, and may have even created one of the earliest forms of writing in the Americas. Their artistic and religious symbols, like the feathered serpent and the word jaguar, would echo through the centuries in later cultures. Then, around 400 BCE, their world began to contract. Their great centers, first San Lorenzo and later La Venta, were not overrun by conquerors. Instead, they were deliberately and systematically abandoned. Monuments were defaced, buried, or carefully arranged in lines, as if in a final ritual act before the people simply walked away. By 350 BCE, the heartland of Olmec civilization was silent. What could cause such an influential society to dismantle its own centers and fade into obscurity? Unlike the Mycenaeans, there is no evidence of a cataclysmic invasion. The theories point instead to internal and environmental pressures. One compelling idea involves environmental degradation. The Olmecs relied heavily on farming, and some studies suggest their agricultural practices may have led to soil depletion or salinization over centuries, slowly undermining their food supply. Another possibility is a shift in vital river courses, which would have disrupted trade and transportation networks that were the lifeblood of their cities. There is also evidence of significant volcanic activity in the region around this time, which could have blanketed farmland with ash and triggered climate disruptions. Social or political upheaval from within is another strong candidate. Perhaps growing inequality or conflict between ruling elites and a restive population led to a loss of faith in the system, causing people to simply disperse back to smaller, simpler village life. The Olmec decline feels less like a sudden collapse and more like a slow unraveling, a civilization gradually losing its cohesion until its grand projects were no longer sustainable. Their vanishing act is profound because they did not fall to a known enemy. They simply receded, leaving their colossal heads staring out from the jungle as if waiting for a people who would never return. The story of a civilization can sometimes be written in water or in its desperate absence. In the harsh, arid landscapes of what is now southern Jordan, the Nabateans did not just survive the desert, they mastered it. These ingenious traders built their wealth and their legendary capital, Petra, by controlling one of the most precious commodities of the ancient world, not gold but frankincense and myrrh. These aromatic resins, harvested from trees in southern Arabia, were burned in temples and used in rituals across the Mediterranean and Near East, making the trade routes that carried them immensely lucrative. The Nabateans positioned themselves as the essential middlemen, guarding the caravan trails that snaked through the desert. With the wealth this generated, they performed what seems like a miracle of stone. Petra, the rose-red city, was not built but carved. They sculpted monumental facades, tombs, and temples directly from the vibrant sandstone cliffs, creating a breathtaking urban center hidden within a narrow canyon. Their most famous structure, the treasury, or al-Khosne, with its ornate Hellenistic style, still strikes awe into every visitor, but their true genius was invisible. In a region that receives only about 6 inches of rain a year, the Nabateans became hydrological engineers without equal. They constructed a vast, complex system of dams, cisterns, and channels that captured every precious drop of seasonal floodwater, storing it and distributing it throughout the city. This allowed Petra to support a population of perhaps 20,000 people, complete with gardens and public fountains in the heart of a desert. For centuries, they maintained their independence and prosperity, a desert kingdom thriving against all odds. Then, in the year 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan formally annexed the Nabatean kingdom, making it the province of Arabia Petraea. This was not a violent conquest but a political absorption. Petra initially continued as a prosperous Roman city, but its unique power was already fading. The Romans began to favor sea routes for the incense trade, using the Red Sea and bypassing the long, arduous desert caravans. Slowly, Petra's economic reason for being eroded. Earthquakes in the 4th and 7th centuries CE caused severe damage, accelerating its decline. Yet the deeper mystery of the Nabateans is not the abandonment of their city, which happened gradually over centuries, but the disappearance of their culture itself. They had their own gods, like the chief deity Dashara, and their own distinct Aramaic dialect. After the Roman annexation, they did not suffer a genocide or a mass exodus. Instead, they seem to have gradually assimilated. Over generations, they adopted Greco-Roman culture, then later converted to Christianity and finally to Islam. Their language faded, their religious practices transformed, and their unique identity dissolved into the wider tapestry of the region. They did not vanish in a dramatic collapse, but through a slow cultural diffusion, choosing or being compelled to blend into the new worlds that succeeded them. Petra stands today not as a tomb for a murdered people, but as a majestic, empty shell, a testament to a culture that chose to leave its mark in stone, only to let its own story quietly fade into the sands of time, leaving us to wonder where a people truly goes when they stop being themselves. High in the sheer cliff faces of the American Southwest, entire cities were built into the rock. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, created a civilization of stunning adaptation. From around 700 CE, they engineered massive, multi-story stone pueblos in places like Choco Canyon, structures that aligned precisely with solar and lunar cycles. They carved out hundreds of rooms in the alcoves of Mesa Verde, accessible only by precarious hand and toe holds or removable ladders. This was more than simple shelter, it was a society of profound complexity. They constructed a vast network of perfectly straight roads, some 30 feet wide, radiating out from Choco Canyon for hundreds of miles across the desert, connecting outlying communities in a grand cultural web. Then, in the late 13th century, within a generation or two, they walked away from it all. They left behind pottery, tools, even food stores in these magnificent cliffside apartments. It was a complete and coordinated exodus. What could compel an entire people to abandon architectural marvels they had invested centuries in building? The primary suspect is written in the very trees they used for their roof beams. Scientists studying tree rings have identified a devastating megadrought that gripped the region for multiple decades, from around 1276 to 1299 CE. This was not a few dry years, it was a climatic catastrophe that would have withered crops, emptied reservoirs, and made life in these densely populated centers nearly impossible. The strain on resources must have been immense, yet was drought the sole villain? Some archaeologists point to signs of social unrest. In the final decades, settlements show evidence of increased fortification, with doors and windows being sealed up or made smaller, perhaps for defense. There are also instances of violence, including unburied bodies, suggesting periods of conflict. Could generations of drought have sparked internal warfare over dwindling supplies? Another theory suggests a spiritual or religious catalyst. The great houses of Choco Canyon seem to have been less about everyday living and more about ceremonial gathering. Perhaps a prolonged environmental crisis led to a loss of faith in the religious systems centered on these places, prompting people to seek a new spiritual homeland. The most compelling aspect of their disappearance, however, is that it likely was not an end but a migration. Oral histories and cultural links strongly suggest the ancestral Pueblones did not vanish, they moved. They dispersed to areas with more reliable water along the Rio Grande and to the mesas of central Arizona, eventually becoming the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples like the Hopi and Zuni. So the mystery shifts from wondering where they went to understanding why they left so suddenly and completely. Was it a desperate flight from famine, a violent societal fracture, or a deliberate spiritual journey to a promised land? The silent stone cities, perched like empty nests in the cliffs, hold the question but keep the answer, a testament to a people who chose a difficult future over a beautiful but dying home. While the ancestral Pueblones faced a desert drought, a tropical empire half a world away may have been undone by its own greatest achievement. The Khmer Empire, centered at the sprawling city of Angkor, was the dominant power in Southeast Asia for over 6 centuries. At its zenith, it controlled much of modern Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Its crowning glory was and remains Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed, a staggering temple complex originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. But Angkor Wat was just the jewel in a vast urban crown. The city of Angkor itself was an engineering marvel on an almost unimaginable scale, a low-density metropolis that may have been home to nearly 1 million people at its peak. Its secret was not stone but water. The Khmer engineers transformed the landscape into a massive hydraulic machine. They constructed an intricate network of canals, moats, and gigantic rectangular reservoirs called barrays. The largest of these, the West Barray, is 5 miles long and 1.4 miles wide, an artificial lake holding over 50 million cubic meters of water. This system did more than just provide drinking water, it was the engine of their empire. It allowed them to harvest rice 3 or 4 times a year, supporting a huge population and a lavish court, and it likely had profound religious significance, representing the Hindu cosmic ocean. For centuries, this delicate balance between nature and infrastructure sustained unparalleled grandeur. Then, in the 15th century, the Khmer kings abandoned Angkor. The capital shifted south to the area of Phnom Penh, and the great city was slowly reclaimed by the jungle. For a long time, history books pointed to a single, dramatic cause: invasion by the rising Ayutthaya kingdom from what is now Thailand. While there were indeed attacks and periods of conflict, modern archaeological and environmental research tells a more complex and cautionary tale. The very system that made Angkor possible may have also sown the seeds of its decline. Scientists studying sediment cores from the moats and barrays have uncovered a story of ecological strain. The Khmer's vast water network required constant, meticulous maintenance. Over centuries, deforestation from expanding agriculture led to increased erosion. Silt and sediment clogged the canals and reservoirs, reducing their capacity and efficiency. At the same time, evidence points to a series of severe, prolonged droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries, interspersed with periods of intense monsoon flooding. This 1-2 punch of climatic volatility would have been catastrophic. The over-engineered, silted-up system could not buffer these extremes. Droughts would have caused crop failure and famine, while violent floods would have breached canals and damaged infrastructure. The social contract, the belief that the god-king could control the waters, would have shattered. The result was not a sudden, violent end, but a gradual, grinding collapse. The elite and the population likely drifted away over decades, seeking more reliable environments near the major rivers to the south. The invasion from Ayutthaya may have been less a cause and more a final blow to a society already critically weakened from within. Angkor's story is a powerful reminder that even the most brilliant human inventions exist in a fragile pact with the natural world, and that a civilization can become a victim of its own monumental success. The silent giants of Easter Island stand with their backs to the sea, gazing inward over a landscape that has become a global parable for environmental ruin. For decades, the story of the Rapa Nui people seemed tragically clear. Their ancestors, we were told, committed a form of cultural suicide. In their fervor to carve and transport the massive stone moai, they cut down every last palm tree, triggering catastrophic soil erosion, the collapse of agriculture, and a descent into warfare, cannibalism, and societal collapse. This narrative of ecocide is powerful and cautionary, but newer archaeological and historical evidence paints a far more complex and heartbreaking picture. The truth is, the Rapa Nui were masters of adaptation in an incredibly fragile environment. They did clear forests, yes, but they also developed sophisticated rock gardens to enrich the soil and likely managed the remaining resources carefully for centuries. The society that erected nearly 900 moai was not in a state of perpetual crisis. It was stable and resilient. The real catastrophe arrived not from within, but from the horizon. Beginning in the 1720s, European explorers made contact, and with them came invisible killers, diseases like smallpox, to which the isolated islanders had no immunity, ravaged the population. Then came the slave raiders. In the 1860s, Peruvian ships carried out devastating raids, kidnapping over 1,000 people, nearly half the population, to work in brutal conditions in South America. Fewer than a dozen ever returned, and they brought back more epidemics. This series of external shocks, concentrated within just a few generations, shattered the social and religious fabric that had sustained the moai culture. The old ways, the knowledge of how to carve and move the statues, the lineage of the chiefs, became unsustainable. In the aftermath, a new warrior cult, the Birdman tradition, rose from the chaos. The society that survived was a transformed one, a culture rebuilding from unimaginable trauma, having lost not just its people but the very memory of how its greatest achievements were accomplished. The moai were toppled not by civil war, but perhaps in a profound rejection of the old gods who had failed to protect them from this new, incomprehensible evil. So the lesson of Easter Island shifts. It is less a simple tale of ecological folly and more a stark story of a resilient culture that survived its own environmental challenges, only to be brutally dismantled by the forces of a connected world it never asked to join. The statues stand fallen not as markers of self-destruction, but as monuments to a civilization interrupted, their silent faces holding a grief far deeper than we once imagined. The story of a people can sometimes be told by the single point of a spear. Across North America, from coast to coast, archaeologists have unearthed a distinct and deadly signature, the Clovis Point. These stone spear tips are masterpieces of ancient engineering, fluted with a long groove down the center to allow for secure hafting to a wooden shaft. For decades, the culture that made them was believed to be the first human presence in the Americas, a pioneering people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge and swiftly spread south around 13,000 years ago. Their name comes from the town of Clovis, New Mexico, where these points were first found alongside the bones of mammoths, proving they were hunters of the great Ice Age beasts. The Clovis culture appeared suddenly, was remarkably widespread, and then, just as abruptly, vanished from the record about 12,800 years ago. So what happened to these formidable hunters? The mystery of their disappearance is tangled with an even greater one: the sudden extinction of North America's megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats all vanished in a geological blink of an eye at roughly the same time. One of the most dramatic and controversial explanations is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory proposes that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid fragmented and exploded in the atmosphere above North America, or struck the ice sheet covering modern-day Canada. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic: continent-wide firestorms, a tremendous heat pulse, and a shockwave that would have leveled forests. The longer-term effect was a rapid return to glacial conditions, a cold snap called the Younger Dryas that lasted over 1,000 years. Proponents argue this climate catastrophe would have destroyed the habitats of the megafauna and shattered the Clovis way of life, which was so dependent on hunting these large animals. Evidence cited includes a thin, dark layer of sediment at archaeological sites from this period, containing microscopic diamonds, unusual soot, and other materials that could be of extraterrestrial origin. Yet, this hypothesis is fiercely debated. Many scientists point out that the evidence is not consistently found across all sites, and that natural processes could explain some of it. This leads to other compelling theories. One long-standing idea is overkill. Could the highly efficient Clovis hunters, armed with their superior spear points, have hunted the slow-breeding megafauna to extinction? If the animals disappeared, the culture built around hunting them would have had to radically change or collapse. Others suggest a more subtle transition. Perhaps the Clovis culture did not vanish so much as evolve. As climates changed and big game became scarce, the technology adapted. The distinctive fluted point may have simply given way to new, more regional styles of tool-making for hunting smaller game and gathering diverse plants. The people themselves, the descendants of the Clovis pioneers, would have stayed, but their archaeological signature changed beyond our current recognition. The disappearance of the Clovis culture forces us to ask a profound question. Do we recognize the end of a people only when their most iconic artifact is no longer made? Their story may not be one of extinction, but of transformation, a society forced by a changing world, whether by comet or climate, to reinvent itself entirely, leaving behind only the elegant stone points as a monument to a world of giants that they once knew. Deep in the Neolithic forests and plains of Eastern Europe, a culture practiced a tradition that seems unthinkable to us today. The Cucuteni Tripilia people, flourishing from around 5500 to 3500 BCE, built some of the largest settlements on Earth at that time. Their mega sites, like Talyanki in modern-day Ukraine, could cover an area of over 400 hectares, larger than many medieval cities, and may have housed up to 20,000 people. These were not temporary camps, but planned communities with concentric rows of houses, workshops, and communal spaces. They were master potters, creating stunning ceramic vessels painted with intricate spiral and serpent motifs, a signature art that speaks of a rich symbolic world. Intriguingly, the vast majority of their figurines are female, leading some scholars to suggest this may have been a society with strong matriarchal or goddess-centered elements. Yet their most baffling practice was not how they lived, but how they chose to leave. Every 60 to 80 years, with a consistency that feels almost calendrical, they would deliberately set their entire settlement ablaze. They would remove valuable items and then burn every house to the ground in a controlled ritual inferno. After the ashes cooled, they would build a brand new, nearly identical village right on top of the old one or nearby. This was not an act of war or panic, but a purposeful, generation-spanning tradition. What profound belief could compel a community to destroy its own hard-built home in a cycle of creation and purification? The burning may have been a way to spiritually cleanse the community, to ward off evil, or to make a sacrificial offering to the earth or their gods. It was a reset button pressed by an entire culture. This cycle continued for centuries until it stopped. Around 3500 BCE, the massive settlements were abandoned for good, the pottery traditions faded, and the culture dissolved into the mists of prehistory. Their end presents another classic mystery of ancient vanishings. One major theory points to people on the move. This is the time when many linguists believe Proto-Indo-European speaking pastoralists from the steppes, often called the Kurgans for their burial mounds, began expanding westward. Did these mobile, possibly horse-riding groups overrun or displace the settled, agricultural Trypillians? There is some archaeological evidence of conflict from this period, but no clear smoking gun of a wholesale invasion. The other leading theory looks inward and downward to the land itself. Supporting such enormous, concentrated populations required intensive farming. Over centuries, this could have led to severe deforestation and soil exhaustion. At the same time, climate data suggests a shift toward a cooler, drier period around this time. The double pressure of a failing environment and a strained social structure may have caused the culture to fragment. People might have dispersed into smaller, more mobile groups, who were then gradually absorbed by neighboring cultures, including the incoming steppe peoples. The planned ritual burnings make their final disappearance uniquely poignant. For generations, they mastered the cycle of death and rebirth. They knew how to end a chapter and begin anew. But when the final, unplanned end came, whether from outside pressure or internal collapse, the knowledge of how to rebuild was lost. The great burning ceased, and the ashes grew cold forever, leaving behind only the beautiful, broken pottery and the ghostly outlines of cities that were meant to be temporary, but whose absence feels eternal. Far from the ritual fires of Trypillia on the arid north coast of Peru, a culture mastered earth and water to build a civilization of startling artistry and brutal power. The Moch, who thrived from around 100 CE to 800 CE, created a world of profound contrast. They are renowned for their breathtakingly realistic portrait vessels, ceramic jars molded into the faces of individuals with such specific personal detail that we can see scars, wrinkles, and expressions. They were unparalleled goldsmiths, crafting intricate ceremonial regalia from hammered and soldered metal. Their architectural ambition is still visible in the colossal Huaca del Sol, the Pyramid of the Sun, a giant adobe brick monument that was once the largest structure in the Americas. This was a society ruled by a formidable priestly elite, often depicted in art as the warrior priest or the priestess, who presided over elaborate rituals that blended religion, politics, and spectacle. Their art leaves little doubt about the source of their authority, frequently showing scenes of sacred warfare, ritual combat, and the presentation of ceremonial cups filled with the blood of captives to powerful deities. For centuries, this system held, supported by ingenious irrigation canals that turned desert valleys into fertile farmland. Then, in the 6th century, the foundations of their world literally began to wash away. Scientific core samples taken from the region's lakes and glaciers tell a story of climatic chaos. A catastrophic mega El Niño event, far more severe than any in modern memory, struck the coast. For 30 long years, the Pacific Ocean released torrents of warm water and moisture into the atmosphere. The result was not a single storm, but decades of relentless, catastrophic flooding. The Moch's carefully engineered canals would have been obliterated, their adobe brick pyramids made of sun-dried mud severely eroded. Fields were drowned under silt and salt water. Just as the society was reeling from this deluge, the pendulum swung violently the other way. The mega El Niño was followed by a prolonged, severe drought lasting another 30 years. The rivers ran dry and the sun baked the ruined fields into a hard crust. This 1-2 punch of climatic extremes would have been utterly devastating. Agriculture, the absolute bedrock of Moch power and population, collapsed. famine would have been widespread and inescapable. In this crucible of suffering, the social contract shattered. The priestly elite, whose divine mandate was to ensure fertility and order, had failed. Their gods seemingly had turned against them. Archaeological evidence from their northern capital shows a sudden and violent end. Defensive walls were hastily erected within sacred precincts, a sign of internal conflict. There is evidence of warfare, and the great Huaca del Sol itself was partially looted and abandoned. The central authority dissolved, and the unified Moch culture fragmented into smaller, competing chiefdoms in the valleys further south. They did not vanish entirely, but their political unity and grand artistic traditions disintegrated under the weight of environmental trauma. The Moch collapse is a stark lesson in vulnerability. It shows how even the most powerful, artistically brilliant civilization can be brought to its knees not by a foreign army, but by the uncontrollable forces of the sky and sea, and by the inevitable human turmoil that follows when the gods fall silent and the food runs out. The Moch faced a climate they could not control, but another vanished society may have fallen because they refused to change the one thing they could themselves. In the late 10th century, Viking explorers led by the fiery-tempered Eric the Red sailed west from Iceland, discovering a massive glacier-rimmed land. With a marketer's flair, Eric called it Greenland, hoping the name would attract settlers. It worked. Hundreds of Norse families arrived, establishing two main settlements on the southwestern coast. For nearly 500 years, they clung to the edge of the known world. They built sturdy stone and turf farmhouses, founded a cathedral and nearly a dozen churches, and even sent tusks from Greenland walrus to Europe as tribute. Their communities, the eastern and western settlements, represented the furthest reach of medieval European civilization. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, and tried to replicate the manorial lifestyle they had known in Iceland and Norway. They wore woolen clothing, prayed to the Christian god in their own dioceses, and saw themselves as Europeans, not Arctic pioneers. This self-image would become their fatal flaw. By the mid-15th century, the last written record mentions a wedding in the eastern settlement. After that, only silence. When a ship finally visited again decades later, the settlers were gone. The farms stood empty, the churches cold. What happened to the Greenland Norse? Their end was not sudden, but a slow, grinding failure played out over generations. The primary antagonist was the climate. Not long after their arrival, the relatively warm medieval warm period began to wane, giving way to the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter and cooler, winters longer and more severe. This shift made their already marginal farming increasingly difficult. Hay crops failed, limiting the fodder needed to overwinter their livestock. The sea ice expanded, making the vital shipping routes to Iceland and Norway more treacherous and less frequent. They were becoming isolated, but their economy depended on that connection, trading walrus ivory and hides for essential iron, timber, and grain. As trade dwindled, so did their supply of the very materials needed for survival and repair. Yet their environment was not empty. During the Norse tenure, another people migrated into Greenland from the north, the ancestors of the modern Inuit known as the Thule culture. These newcomers were supreme specialists of the Arctic. They hunted ringed seals and whales from sleek kayaks and umiaks, used toggle harpoons, wore tailored skin clothing far superior to wool in the damp cold, and built temporary snow houses on the ice. The Norse and the Thule coexisted for centuries, but the archaeological record suggests limited and often hostile interaction. The Norse sagas mention skraelings, a derogatory term for the natives, and describe clashes. Here lies the heart of the mystery. The Thule thrived in the very conditions that were killing the Norse. They possessed the knowledge and technology to survive the changing climate. But the Norse, bound by their cultural identity as Christian farmers and Europeans, largely refused to learn from them. They continued to prioritize their failing dairy farms over adopting the superior marine hunting techniques of their neighbors. They starved beside a sea full of food they did not know how to catch efficiently. The end was likely a combination of malnutrition, economic collapse, and possibly conflict as a shrinking Norse population became more vulnerable. Their disappearance is a profound and tragic lesson in cultural inflexibility. They chose to vanish as Europeans rather than survive as something new, leaving behind stone ruins that stand as lonely monuments to a stubborn dream that the Arctic could forever be a greener version of home. The stubbornness of the Greenland Norse finds a strange parallel in a kingdom that faced a similar crossroads, but whose legacy endured in a transformed state. High on the rugged plateaus of the Horn of Africa, the kingdom of Aksum was a titan of the ancient world. At its peak around the 4th century CE, it was a contemporary and equal of Rome, Persia, and China, a name mentioned with respect in foreign chronicles. This was no isolated outpost. Aksum commanded the lucrative trade routes of the Red Sea, its mighty port of Adulis funneling ivory, gold, exotic animals, and frankincense from the African interior to the markets of the Mediterranean and beyond. With this wealth, Aksumite kings minted their own gold coins, a bold statement of sovereignty that circulated from Alexandria to India. They erected monumental stone stelae, towering obelisks carved to resemble multi-story buildings, the largest of which, now fallen, stood over 100 feet tall, a feat of engineering that proclaimed their power to the heavens. In a pivotal historical shift, King Azana converted to Christianity in the 4th century, making Aksum one of the very first Christian kingdoms on earth, a spiritual identity that would become the bedrock of Ethiopian culture for millennia. For centuries, Aksum thrived as a cosmopolitan hub, its influence stretching across the sea to southern Arabia. Then, after the 7th century, its imperial star began to wane. The grand stelae were no longer raised, the coinage ceased, and the kingdom slowly receded from the world stage, contracting into the highland heartland. Why did this great power fade? The decline appears to have been a slow squeeze from multiple directions. One persistent theory points to environmental strain. Aksum's agricultural prowess, which fed its cities and armies, depended on reliable rainfall and fertile soil. Some evidence suggests a combination of climate change and human activity may have led to deforestation and soil exhaustion, gradually undermining the economic foundation of the state. A more immediate and dramatic shift came from the north. In the 7th century, the explosive rise of the Islamic caliphates fundamentally redrew the map of global trade. As the caliphates unified the Middle East, the old Red Sea trade routes that were Aksum's lifeblood began to be bypassed. New overland routes through the Islamic world and direct maritime passages across the Indian Ocean diverted commerce away from the Aksumite coast. The kingdom was economically marginalized, cut off from the wealth and cultural exchange that had fueled its golden age. There is also the possibility of internal overexploitation, where the demands of a monumental building elite may have drained resources from the wider population. Yet, unlike so many cultures on this list, Aksum did not vanish. Its political and economic power collapsed, but its cultural and spiritual core survived. The civilization transformed, retreating and regrouping in the more defensible highlands. The Christian faith of Azana took deep root, and the Aksumite lineage evolved into the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, claiming descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The great stelae fields stand today not as markers of an ending, but as the birthplace of an enduring civilization that chose to change its form rather than disappear, leaving us to ponder the fine line between the collapse of an empire and the rebirth of a nation. The transition from imperial power to cultural survival is a theme echoed across the world, but few vanishings have captured the modern imagination like that of the classic Maya. Here is a crucial distinction: the Maya people never disappeared. Millions of their descendants live in Central America today, preserving languages and traditions that stretch back millennia. The true mystery is the collapse of their magnificent classic civilization. a network of rival city-states that reached staggering intellectual and artistic heights between 250 and 900 CE. In the dense rainforests of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, they built soaring limestone pyramids that pierced the jungle canopy. Cities like Tikal, with its towering temples, and Palenque, with its elegant palace and intricate bas-reliefs, were centers of profound learning. The Maya developed the most sophisticated writing system in the Americas, a complex combination of logograms and syllabic signs carved into stone and painted on bark paper. They were master astronomers, tracking the cycles of Venus and the Sun with such precision their calendar was more accurate than any in contemporary Europe. Their rulers, depicted in elaborate headdresses, were seen as divine intermediaries, conducting rituals to ensure the cosmic order and the arrival of life-giving rains. Then, in a rolling catastrophe between the 8th and 9th centuries, the heart of this civilization simply stopped beating. One by one, the great cities in the southern lowlands fell silent. In Tikal, the last dated monument was erected in 869 CE. In Palenque, the final king's reign ended around 899. The stelae, the stone records of kings and conquests, were no longer carved. The grand palaces and plazas were gradually abandoned to the encroaching jungle. This was not a single event, but a systemic failure that unfolded over decades. What could cause such a sophisticated society to walk away from its urban cores? Modern research points not to one cause, but to a perfect storm of interconnected crises. At the foundation was a severe and prolonged drought. Scientists studying sediment cores from regional lakes have found compelling evidence of multi-decade megadroughts during the very centuries of the collapse. For a civilization utterly dependent on seasonal rains for agriculture and drinking water, this was an existential threat. Reservoirs dried up and crops failed repeatedly. But climate alone does not tell the full story. The Maya political world was already under immense strain. The city-states were locked in a cycle of intense warfare, not for territory so much as for capturing rival nobles for ritual sacrifice, a competition for prestige and divine favor. Monumental art from this period shows an increasing obsession with conquest and captive-taking. This constant conflict drained resources and destabilized the region. Furthermore, centuries of success had led to overpopulation in the urban centers, putting unsustainable pressure on the local environment. To clear land for agriculture and to produce lime plaster for their monuments, the Maya engaged in widespread deforestation. This loss of tree cover would have reduced local rainfall through decreased transpiration and increased soil erosion, ironically worsening the very drought they feared. The combination was devastating. A series of poor harvests from drought and degraded soil would have led to famine and social unrest. The divine king, whose primary duty was to bring rain and prosperity, would have lost all legitimacy. Faith in the entire political and religious order crumbled. People did not die out, they simply voted with their feet, dispersing from the great cities to smaller, more sustainable settlements elsewhere. The classic Maya collapse is a masterclass in how environmental pressure can amplify social and political weaknesses, turning a series of manageable problems into a civilization-ending cascade. The jungle reclaimed the stone plazas, leaving the silent pyramids as monuments to a cosmic bargain that, in the end, the rain simply refused to keep. The silent pyramids of the Maya were not the only monumental cities to be reclaimed by nature. Across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis, a different kind of urban center once rose from the fertile floodplain. This was Cahokia, the beating heart of the Mississippian culture, and for centuries it was the largest city north of Mexico. At its zenith around 1100 CE, it sprawled across more than 6 square miles, a bustling metropolis home to perhaps 20,000 people, a population that would not be matched in the region until the late 18th century. The skyline was not defined by stone spires, but by over 120 earthen mounds. The greatest of these, Monk's Mound, is a colossal four-tiered platform covering 14 acres at its base and rising 100 feet high, a volume of earth that rivals the pyramids of Egypt. This was not just a big village, it was the capital of a complex chiefdom society, a political and religious powerhouse whose influence stretched across the mid-continent. Cahokia sat at the crossroads of a vast trade network. From its central plaza, goods flowed in from hundreds of miles away: marine shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and chert for tools from the Ozarks. This exchange of materials was also an exchange of ideas, rituals, and symbols, most notably the Southern ceremonial complex, whose imagery of falcon warriors, weeping eyes, and the hand-in-eye motif appears on artifacts from Oklahoma to Alabama. The city was a carefully planned cosmological diagram, with its central mounds aligned to solar events like the summer solstice sunrise. A circle of massive red cedar posts, now called Woodhenge, functioned as a solar calendar, marking the changing seasons for a society deeply tied to the agricultural cycle of maize, beans, and squash. Then, by the mid-1300s, the great city was empty. The mounds stood silent over abandoned neighborhoods, the elaborate trade networks faded. The Mississippian cultural fluorescence in the region dissipated. What caused the people to leave this engineered landscape? There was no invading army, no evidence of a single catastrophic event. Instead, the decline appears as a slow, centuries-long process of depopulation and cultural transformation. One of the most significant pressures was likely climate. Tree ring data reveals a period known as the Little Ice Age began to set in during the 14th century, bringing cooler, wetter conditions to the region. For a society dependent on a precise growing season for maize, a shift toward later springs and earlier falls could have led to repeated crop failures, malnutrition, and social stress. There is also evidence of localized environmental exhaustion. Supporting such a dense urban population would have required immense resources. Overhunting may have depleted local deer and other game populations, while intensive farming could have degraded the soil over generations. Social factors almost certainly played a role. Maintaining the hierarchical chiefdom system required a surplus of food and labor to support the elite and fund grand construction projects. As environmental pressures squeezed that surplus, the social contract may have frayed. Archaeological evidence from this period shows an increase in palisade construction around the central precinct, suggesting a rise in conflict or perceived threat, possibly from within. Some scholars propose a kind of religious or ideological reformation. Perhaps after generations of central authority, people lost faith in the ruling chief priests and their ability to ensure prosperity. The grand ceremonies atop Monk's Mound may have lost their meaning in the face of hunger and hardship, leading communities to consciously disperse, seeking a simpler, more sustainable life in smaller, more scattered settlements. By the time European explorers arrived, the mounds were ancient, overgrown relics, and the descendants of the Mississippians had reorganized into the smaller, decentralized tribal societies encountered by history. Cahokia's story is one of astonishing rise and quiet unraveling, a reminder that even the most impressive earthly monuments are sustained not just by soil and stone, but by a fragile consensus of belief, bounty, and shared purpose. While Cahokia faded through dispersal, another culture vanished by traveling so far it became unrecognizable. The story of the Yuezhi is one of the most dramatic reinventions in ancient history. Chinese historical records from the Han Dynasty describe them as a powerful nomadic confederation living in the grasslands of what is now Western China. They were Indo-European speakers, likely tall and fair-haired, standing out among their eastern neighbors. Their wealth and influence came from controlling a vital trade route, the legendary Jade Road, funneling precious nephrite jade from the mines of Central Asia into the courts of China. For centuries, they were a major force, intermediaries between the settled Chinese empires and the wilder steppes. Then, around 160 BCE, their world shattered. A rising nomadic power to their east, the formidable Xiongnu Confederacy, launched a devastating attack. The Yuezhi were decisively defeated and their king was killed. The Xiongnu leader, it is said, made a drinking cup from the slain king's skull. This was more than a military loss, it was a cultural death sentence. The surviving Yuezhi were driven from their homeland, beginning a long, desperate migration westward into the unknown. In Chinese records, they simply disappear, a lost people swallowed by the vastness of Central Asia. The mystery of their vanishing, however, has a spectacular answer. They did not die out. They traveled over 1,000 miles through hardship and conflict, finally settling in the rich, Hellenistic-influenced region of Bactria in modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. Here, they ceased to be the Yuezhi. Over generations, they absorbed local customs, intermarried, and their language evolved. From the fragments of this migrating confederation, a new power coalesced, the Kushan Empire. By the 1st century CE, the Kushans ruled a vast territory stretching from Central Asia deep into northern India. They became legendary patrons of Buddhism, building monumental stupas and sponsoring the Gandharan school of art, which produced some of the most serene and beautiful Buddha statues in history, blending Greek artistic techniques with Buddhist spirituality. The Kushans issued coins bearing images of Greek, Persian, Hindu, and Buddhist deities reflecting their cosmopolitan empire. So the Yuezhi, the jade traders of the Chinese frontier, had utterly transformed. Their name, their language, their homeland, and even their primary religious identity were gone. They became something entirely new, so successfully that for centuries, scholars did not connect the dots between the defeated nomads in Chinese annals and the glorious Buddhist emperors of the Silk Road. Their story redefines disappearance. It asks us whether a culture truly vanishes if its people endure, but choose a future so different that their past becomes a forgotten prologue. Buried in the parched sands of the Taklamakan Desert, a discovery rewrote the ancient history of China. In the late 20th century, archaeologists excavating the Tarim Basin in China's far western Xinjiang region uncovered mummies with features that seemed profoundly out of place. These were not the bodies of East Asian peoples, but of individuals with light hair, long noses, and tartan-patterned textiles. Preserved for nearly 4,000 years by the dry, salty earth, these Caucasian mummies wore tall, conical hats and were buried with wheels and other artifacts that spoke of a distant homeland. Genetic and linguistic analysis revealed they were the Tocharians, an Indo-European people who had migrated eastward across the steppes millennia before, settling in the remote oasis towns along what would become the Silk Road. They spoke a unique language, Tocharian, which was related to ancient Celtic and Latin but written in a script borrowed from India. For centuries, they thrived as middlemen and farmers, their oasis settlements like Kucha and Turfan becoming vital way stations in the exchange of goods and ideas between China, India, and the West. Their culture was a fascinating hybrid, blending influences from all directions while maintaining their distinct European roots in the heart of Asia. So how does such a distinctive people simply vanish from the historical record? Their disappearance is not a story of sudden catastrophe, but of a slow, inexorable fade. The Tocharians did not fall to a conquering army in a single battle. Instead, they were gradually absorbed by the tides of history. As the Silk Road grew in importance, their oasis cities became magnets for traders, missionaries, and migrants from across Eurasia. From the east came Han Chinese settlers and soldiers. From the north and west came waves of nomadic peoples, first the Xiongnu, then later Turkic tribes like the Uyghurs, and eventually the Mongols under Genghis Khan. Each new wave brought its own language, customs, and genes. Intermarriage became common. To survive and prosper in this new demographic landscape, the Tocharians likely adopted the languages and social practices of the more numerous or politically dominant newcomers. Their unique Tocharian language, once used in Buddhist monastic texts and commercial documents, slowly fell out of daily use, replaced by Turkic dialects and Chinese. Their distinct cultural identity dissolved into the broader tapestry of the region. By the time the famous Venetian explorer Marco Polo traveled through the area in the 13th century, the Tocharian people as a separate entity were already a memory. Their genetic legacy lived on in the local population, but their language, their customs, and their sense of themselves as a distinct people had been assimilated. The haunting mummies they left behind are therefore not just bodies, they are time capsules of a forgotten branch of the human family, a poignant reminder that a culture can vanish not through violence or environmental collapse, but through the quiet, relentless process of blending in, until one day no one remembers what it was to be Tocharian at all. The Arctic silence holds more than just ice and wind. It holds the memory of a people who mastered its extremes for 2,000 years, only to leave behind a ghostly absence. This is the story of the Dorset culture, a Paleo-Eskimo society that thrived in the harsh landscapes of the Canadian Arctic and Greenland from around 500 BCE. Their world was one of profound specialization, a testament to human ingenuity in the planet's most unforgiving environment. They did not build cities or monuments. Their legacy is written in a unique and elegant toolkit. They carved delicate, symmetrical points from chert and slate, crafting harpoons and lances perfectly designed for hunting seals and walrus at their breathing holes in the sea ice. They built semi-subterranean houses from stone and sod, and they are the first known people to have crafted exquisite miniature carvings from ivory and antler, depicting polar bears, seals, and enigmatic human figures with haunting, expressive faces. For nearly 2 millennia, they were the sole human inhabitants of the Eastern Arctic, a culture in perfect sync with the rhythm of ice and animal. Then, around 1500 CE, as a new people were moving eastward into their world, the Dorset vanished. Not a single trace of them exists after this date. Their disappearance is not marked by ruins or battlefields, but by a simple, profound silence in the archaeological record. So what happened to these master ice hunters? The timing of their disappearance is the first crucial clue. It coincides almost exactly with the eastward migration of the ancestors of the modern Inuit, a culture known to archaeologists as the Thule. The Thule people, coming from Alaska, brought with them a technological revolution for the Arctic. They had large, open-skin boats called umiaks for hunting whales. They used dog sleds for rapid transportation across vast distances, and they possessed superior sealing equipment, including the toggle harpoon, which was more effective at securing large sea mammals. The Dorset, by contrast, did not have dogs or large boats, and their hunting toolkit, while beautifully made, was suited to a different, perhaps more localized strategy. This has led to the long-standing theory of replacement. Were the Dorset simply outcompeted by the more technologically advanced and socially adaptable Thule? It is a compelling narrative of cultural Darwinism. The Thule, with their ability to hunt the massive bowhead whale, could support larger, more mobile communities. They may have gradually occupied the most productive hunting grounds, putting pressure on Dorset resources. Yet, intriguingly, there is a notable lack of direct evidence for violent conflict between the two groups. No mass graves, no fortified Dorset sites from this period. Their disappearance feels less like a conquest and more like a fading. This opens the door to other possibilities. Could a shifting climate have played a role? The period around 1500 CE falls within the early stages of the Little Ice Age, a time of cooling and expanding sea ice. While both cultures were adapted to cold, the specific changes in ice patterns or animal migrations might have favored the Thule's more versatile toolkit and put stress on the Dorset's highly specialized way of life. Another haunting possibility is disease. The Thule, migrating from the west, may have carried pathogens to which the isolated Dorset population had no immunity. A virgin soil epidemic could have swept through their communities with devastating speed, leaving few traces in the archaeological record beyond empty settlements. The most likely answer is a subtle, tragic combination. A cooling climate may have already stressed Dorset society. Then, the arrival of the Thule, with their superior technology for exploiting a changing environment, could have created an insurmountable competitive pressure. Whether through gradual economic marginalization, the silent spread of illness, or a slow intermarriage and assimilation where Dorset identity simply dissolved, the result was the same. The people who had sung the ice into existence for 2,000 years walked off its stage without a sound, leaving behind only their tiny, beautiful carvings to whisper of a world that was, and a mystery that remains frozen in time. The Arctic silence of the Dorset is broken by a discovery from a Sichuan riverbank that shattered everything historians thought they knew about ancient China. In 1986, workers digging clay for bricks near the town of Sangsingdui struck something hard and metallic. What they uncovered would become one of the most astonishing archaeological finds of the 20th century. Two large sacrificial pits yielded a treasure trove of artifacts so bizarre, so utterly unlike anything found before, they seemed to belong to another world. There were enormous bronze masks with protruding, cylindrical eyes and exaggerated angular features. There were statues of slender, elongated figures standing on pedestals, their hands posed as if holding some long-lost ceremonial object. There was a bronze tree over 13 feet tall, with birds perched on its branches and dragons winding down its trunk. This was not the art of the Shang dynasty, China's celebrated Bronze Age civilization to the north. Shang bronzes were ornate vessels for ritual wine and food, decorated with recognizable animal motifs like the Tauti mask. The Sangsingdui artifacts were something else entirely, monumental, surreal, and focused on the human face in a way that felt almost alien. The discovery proved the existence of a sophisticated, previously unknown civilization that had flourished in the Sichuan Basin over 3,000 years ago, completely independent from the Yellow River Valley cultures that were long considered the sole cradle of Chinese civilization. They had their own unique cosmology, their own artistic language, and a staggering mastery of bronze casting on a colossal scale. Then, around 1100 or 1000 BCE, this vibrant culture did something inexplicable. They took their most sacred and valuable objects, these monumental bronze faces and trees, these delicate gold masks and jade blades, and they deliberately, carefully buried them. They placed them in precisely dug pits arranged in layers, and then set them on fire before covering them with earth. After this ritual interment, they abandoned their religious and political center entirely. The site shows no signs of a violent invasion, no shattered walls or mass graves. It shows a conscious ceremonial closing. So why would a people so invested in these powerful icons choose to bury them and walk away? The leading theory points to a natural disaster. The Sangsingdui settlement was near the banks of the Min River, and geological evidence suggests a massive, catastrophic flood or a series of floods could have devastated the region. In the face of such a divine punishment, the priests and rulers may have believed their gods were angry. The most logical act of atonement would be to sacrifice their most sacred objects to appease the waters, and then relocate to a new, safer homeland. Another possibility is internal upheaval. Perhaps a rival faction overthrew the ruling priestly class, and as part of a religious revolution, they systematically destroyed the old idols, burying them to erase their power before establishing a new order elsewhere. There is also the specter of war with a neighboring culture, though again, the lack of destruction layers at the site itself argues against a battle fought there. The most haunting aspect is the complete absence of writing. While the Shang left oracle bones inscribed with early Chinese script, the Sangsingdui people left no decipherable records at all. Their story is told entirely through these silent, staring faces. Did they see a cataclysm coming and attempt to save their gods by putting them safely into the earth? Or did they lose faith in those gods altogether, consigning them to a fiery grave as they set out to find a new destiny? The pits at Sangsingdui are not tombs for kings. They are a time capsule of a forgotten faith, a civilization's last ritual act before it vanished into the mists, leaving behind only these breathtaking, otherworldly visages to challenge our understanding of China's ancient past. The surreal faces of Sangsingdui were not the only ancient artists to capture the human form in mysterious clay. In the rolling savannas of central Nigeria, a different kind of sculptor was at work, creating a legacy just as enigmatic. This was the Nok culture, one of sub-Saharan Africa's earliest known societies to master both iron smelting and the art of terracotta. Flourishing from around 1500 BCE to 500 CE, their world was one of profound innovation. The Nok are celebrated for their extraordinary terracotta figures, sculptures of people and animals rendered in a distinctive geometric style. These are not crude idols but works of sophisticated artistry. Human figures are depicted with elaborate hairstyles, heavy lips, and triangular or perforated eyes that seem to gaze through time. They wear beads and ornaments, suggesting a society with social hierarchy and a rich aesthetic sense. But their genius was not confined to art. The Nok were among the very first people in Africa, south of the Sahara, to produce iron. They built furnaces to smelt ore, creating tools and weapons that would have given them a significant advantage in farming and hunting. For nearly 2,000 years, this dual tradition of metal and clay flourished, marking the Nok as foundational to the technological and artistic history of West Africa. Then, around 500 CE, their cultural signature begins to fade from the archaeological record. The distinctive terracotta figures are no longer made. The iron smelting sites fall silent. Unlike a city sacked by invaders, there is no clear layer of destruction. The Nok tradition simply seems to dissipate like smoke from a furnace that has burned out. What could cause such a long-lived and advanced culture to vanish without a trace? One compelling theory looks at the very source of their power, iron. Smelting iron on an industrial scale required immense amounts of charcoal, which in turn required cutting down vast tracts of forest. Over centuries, this relentless demand for fuel could have led to severe deforestation around their settlements. The loss of trees would have triggered soil erosion, reduced rainfall through disrupted local climate patterns, and ultimately degraded the farmland that supported their population. In essence, the Nok may have been victims of their own technological success, slowly undermining the environmental foundation that made their society possible. Another possibility is less about disappearance and more about transformation. The Nok did not necessarily die out. Instead, their people, their knowledge, and their artistic sensibilities may have been absorbed into the great cultural waves that followed. Later, more complex West African kingdoms like those of the Yoruba, with their own magnificent terracotta and bronze traditions at Ife, or the Bini Kingdom of Benin, famous for its brass plaques, may have direct cultural or ancestral links to the Nok. The geometric stylization of Nok art finds echoes in later West African sculpture, suggesting a continuum of artistic ideas. The knowledge of ironworking certainly spread southward, becoming a cornerstone of subsequent societies. The challenge in tracing their legacy is a profound lack of continuous excavation and research. Many Nok sites were discovered accidentally by tin miners in the early 20th century, and the terracottas were often removed from their context, stripping away crucial information. Without uncovering more settlements and understanding their full life cycle, the precise endpoint of the Nok remains shrouded. So, did they collapse under the weight of their own industry, or did they simply evolve, their identity blending into the grand tapestry of West African civilization until the original thread was lost? The silent terracotta figures with their wise, perforated eyes hold the answer but offer no words, standing as solemn sentinels to a culture that forged both iron and beauty, only to leave us wondering whether its end was a failure or merely a metamorphosis. The haunting geometric eyes of Nok terracotta find a strange echo in a different medium on the other side of the world. In the arid canyons of what is now southwestern New Mexico, the Mimbers people transformed everyday objects into breathtaking canvases. A branch of the larger Mogollon culture, they are remembered for one astonishing artistic legacy: their black-on-white pottery bowls. These were not mere containers, they were portals into a worldview. Using mineral paints on a white slip, Mimbers artists filled the interiors of their bowls with a stunning array of designs. Some featured intricate, hypnotic geometric patterns, spirals and hatchwork that seemed to pulse with a sacred rhythm. Others broke into the realm of narrative, depicting vivid, naturalistic scenes of the world around them. Rabbits leap, deer run, and bears amble across the curved clay surface. Human figures are shown hunting, dancing, and engaging in rituals. Some of the most compelling images venture into mythology, portraying fantastical creatures like the horned serpent, or scenes that scholars interpret as moments of spiritual transformation. Each bowl was a unique masterpiece, a story told in clay and fire. For about 300 years, from around 950 to 1150 CE, this artistic tradition flourished, making the Mimbers one of the most visually distinctive cultures of the ancient Southwest. Their villages, often set along river valleys, were centers of both practical life and profound artistic expression. Then, around the middle of the 12th century, the painting stopped. The production of these magnificent narrative bowls ceased entirely. While people continued to live in the region, the unique cultural fingerprint of the Mimbers had effectively vanished. What silenced the artists? The timing provides a critical clue. The end of classic Mimbers pottery coincides almost exactly with the onset of the Great Drought, a devastating period of aridification that gripped much of the Southwest for decades. This was the same climatic catastrophe that pressured the ancestral Pueblones at Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon. For the Mimbers, whose agriculture depended on the fragile desert rivers, prolonged drought would have been catastrophic. Streams would have dwindled, water tables dropped, and crops failed repeatedly. In the face of such environmental stress, the intricate social and religious structures that supported specialized artists likely began to unravel. Creating those elaborate bowls required more than skill. It required time, stability, and a community that valued the stories they told enough to support the artisans. When survival becomes a daily crisis, the production of high art is often the first luxury to disappear. But did the people disappear along with their pottery? The archaeological evidence suggests a more complex fate than simple extinction. There is little sign of violent conflict or a sudden, catastrophic abandonment. Instead, the story points toward fragmentation and migration. As conditions worsened, the large, cohesive Mimbers villages may have broken apart. Families or small groups likely dispersed, seeking more reliable water sources elsewhere. Many probably migrated north and east into the territories of other Puebloan groups, like the ancestors of the Zuni or Hopi. In these new homes, they would have integrated, bringing their knowledge and some of their traditions with them. But within a generation or two, their distinct artistic language would have blended with that of their hosts. The specific ritual and social context that gave rise to the narrative bowl was lost. The Mimbers people, as a distinct cultural entity, dissolved into the wider Pueblo world. Their end is therefore a dual mystery. On one level, it is an environmental story, a culture squeezed by a changing climate until its most beautiful practice could no longer be sustained. On a deeper level, it is a story of cultural assimilation. They did not die out, but they stopped being Mimbers. The silencing of their art marks the moment when their unique voice was overwhelmed by the collective struggle to survive, leaving behind only the silent, stunning bowls as eternal illustrations for a story whose final chapter we can only piece together from fragments of bone, clay, and dust. While some cultures dissolved into their surroundings, others chose a different path, retreating into the very earth to protect their soul. High in the isolated, cloud-shrouded peaks of Colombia's Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the Tairona built a civilization that defied both the jungle and, later, history itself. From around 200 CE, they sculpted a world of stone from the steep mountainsides. Their cities were not sprawling metropolises, but intricate networks of terraces, connected by hundreds of miles of stone-paved paths and staircases that snaked through the dense forest. At the heart of their settlements were circular plazas sunken into the earth and lined with stone, used for ceremonies and community gatherings. They were master engineers, constructing sophisticated drainage systems to manage the torrential rains, and even more masterful goldsmiths. Their goldwork, often using an alloy called tumbaga, was not for hoarding but for spiritual connection. They crafted exquisite pendants, nose rings, and ceremonial objects depicting shamans, jaguars, and bat-winged deities, believing the reflective metal connected the earthly and spiritual worlds. For centuries, they thrived in this vertical paradise, a society in harmony with one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. Then, in the early 16th century, Spanish conquistadors arrived on the Caribbean coast, their eyes fixed on the legendary gold of the mountains. What followed was not a swift conquest, but a 75-year-long war of resistance. The Tairona, using their knowledge of the treacherous terrain, fought a relentless guerrilla campaign. They ambushed Spanish soldiers on narrow mountain paths, destroyed settlements, and retreated to ever higher fortifications. They would not be easily broken. But the Spanish brought weapons the mountains could not stop, disease, and a relentless ideology. Finally, after decades of conflict, the Tairona made a momentous decision. They would not fight to the last person. Instead, they would perform a disappearing act. They deliberately abandoned their magnificent lower cities, burning some and leaving others to be swallowed by the jungle. Then they withdrew deeper into the most remote, inaccessible reaches of the Sierra Nevada, places the Spanish had no interest in and could scarcely reach. To the outside world, the Tairona had vanished. Their stone cities were reclaimed by roots and vines, becoming the stuff of local legend, a lost civilization. But they were never lost. They had simply chosen to become invisible. In their mountain sanctuary, the Tairona culture did not die, it transformed. They became the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who live there today, the Kogi, the Wiwa, and the Arhuaco. These communities consider themselves the elder brothers, the direct descendants and guardians of the Tairona legacy. They have preserved the core of that ancient worldview for over 500 years in deliberate, sacred isolation. They see their sacred duty as maintaining the balance of the earth, performing rituals and offerings on behalf of all humanity, whom they call the younger brothers, who have forgotten how to live in harmony with the world. Their disappearance, therefore, is one of the most profound on this list. It was not a collapse but a conscious strategic retreat. It was a culture choosing secrecy over assimilation, preservation over participation. They became lost not through catastrophe, but through a deliberate act of self-protection, leaving their stone cities as silent decoys while their living culture continued, hidden in the misty peaks, a timeless reminder that sometimes to survive, a people must choose to vanish from the story altogether. The strategic retreat of the Tairona stands in stark contrast to a culture erased by the ambitions of its neighbor. On the Korean peninsula, during the tumultuous Three Kingdoms period, a fourth power played a crucial yet ultimately fragile role. This was the Gaya Confederacy, a league of 6 or more autonomous city-states nestled in the fertile Nakdong River basin. While their rivals Silla, Beech, and Goguryeo built centralized kingdoms with grand armies, Gaya thrived on a different kind of power, cooperation, and commerce. They were the iron masters of the peninsula. The region was rich in iron ore, and the Gaya polities became industrial hubs, smelting and forging the metal into weapons, armor, and tools. This wasn't just for local use. They turned their river basin into a bustling economic network. trading their high-quality iron with the Japanese archipelago to the east and with the three Korean kingdoms to the north and west. Their wealth was not measured in vast territories, but in the prosperity of their merchant towns and the contents of their elaborate tombs. These burial mounds, often containing the remains of multiple individuals alongside exquisite gold crowns, pottery, and of course piles of iron ingots, speak of a society where economic clout and skilled craftsmanship defined the elite. For centuries, this confederate system allowed Gaya to navigate the rivalries of its larger neighbors, a crucial middleman in a volatile region. But by the 6th century CE, the geopolitical landscape was shifting dangerously. The Silla kingdom, based in the southeast, was on the rise, aggressively expanding and forging a critical military alliance with the powerful Tang dynasty of China. Silla's gaze turned toward the Nakdong Basin, a vital strategic corridor and the source of Gaya's formidable iron. The end came not with a slow fade, but with a deliberate, systematic conquest. Between 532 and 562 CE, Silla's armies, likely bolstered by Tang tactics and technology, moved from city-state to city-state, dismantling the Gaya confederacy piece by piece. The largest state, Gaya, fell last. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a political and cultural annexation. Silla, intent on unifying the peninsula under its own banner, pursued a policy of thorough assimilation. Gaya's ruling class was absorbed into Silla's own aristocracy, given ranks and titles to secure their loyalty. The common people became subjects of the Silla crown. The distinct Gaya identity, its dialects, its political traditions, and perhaps even its historical narratives, were actively suppressed and overwritten by the victor's story. This is why Gaya feels so mysterious today. Unlike Beech and Goguryeo, whose cultural lineages can be traced more clearly to later Korean states, Gaya's unique voice was largely silenced. The histories that survive were written by Silla's scribes and their successors, who naturally minimized the Confederacy's importance, casting it as a minor player ultimately destined to be absorbed. We know them almost entirely through archaeology, through the silent gold and iron pulled from their tombs, not through their own written records. Their disappearance is a classic and often repeated tragedy of history. A vibrant, innovative culture did not collapse from within or flee from disaster. It was conquered and then meticulously erased from the official story, leaving behind only the physical evidence of its wealth and the haunting question of what other voices have been lost forever to the pen of the conqueror. South of the mighty pyramids of Egypt, another kingdom built monuments to rival them. The kingdom of Kush, rooted in the fertile Nile Valley of Nubia, was far more than just Egypt's neighbor or copycat. This was a formidable African empire that for a time turned the tables of history completely. Around 750 BCE, Kushite kings marched north, conquering a weakened Egypt and establishing themselves as its 25th dynasty, the famed Black Pharaohs. For nearly a century, they ruled both lands, restoring Egyptian traditions and constructing their own monuments. Even after they were pushed back south by an Assyrian invasion, Kush remained a colossal power. They moved their capital south to the city of Meroe, and there they created a signature skyline. The royal cemetery at Meroe is home to over 200 pyramids, built with steep, sharp angles that give them a uniquely powerful and elegant profile against the desert sky. This was a culture with its own profound identity. They worshipped their own gods like the lion-headed Apodamak, and they developed not one but two unique scripts, Meroitic cursive and hieroglyphic, a writing system that, despite our best efforts, remains largely undeciphered today. Theirs was a voice in stone and ink that we can see but cannot yet fully hear. For centuries, Kush was an industrial and commercial titan. Meroe sat atop rich deposits of iron ore and was surrounded by vast forests which provided the charcoal needed for smelting. The city became a sprawling factory, its skies darkened by the smoke of countless furnaces, producing iron tools and weapons that were traded across Africa. This industrial might, however, may have contained the seeds of its own destruction. One leading theory for Kush's decline points directly to this environmental cost. To feed the relentless furnaces, the forests around Mara were likely stripped bare over generations. Deforestation would have led to soil erosion, making agriculture harder in an already marginal environment. The very industry that brought them wealth may have slowly strangled their capacity to feed their people. At the same time, their economic world was shifting. Kush's wealth depended on controlling trade routes between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean. As the Roman Empire's power waned and new trade dynamics emerged, including the rise of Axum to the east, these routes became less profitable. Kush was being squeezed economically. Then came direct pressure. In the early 4th century CE, the Kingdom of Axum, now a Christian power armed with iron weapons of its own, began launching raids deep into Kushite territory. An Aksumite inscription boasts of a king who marched on Mara, destroying statues and burning towns. While this may not have been a single, war-ending conquest, it was a devastating blow to an already weakened state. The combination was fatal: environmental strain, economic decline, and military pressure from a rival. The centralized Kushite state fractured. In its place arose 3 smaller Christian Nubian kingdoms: Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia. These successor states were culturally vibrant and politically strong for centuries, but they represented a profound transformation. The ancient Kushite religion, its undeciphered scripts, and its pharaonic traditions faded away, replaced by Christianity and the Greek alphabet. The kingdom of Kush did not vanish in a day, but its distinct political and cultural identity was lost, absorbed into a new era. The silent, steep-sided pyramids at Mara stand not just as tombs for kings, but as monuments to a forgotten superpower, whose story ended not with a sudden crash, but with a slow sigh into the desert wind, its language still waiting on the stones for someone to understand. From the silent iron furnaces of Kush, we travel north to the high, windswept plateaus of Anatolia, where another empire of metal and law met a sudden, fiery end. The Hittites were not just another Bronze Age kingdom. They were a superpower, the only force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the might of New Kingdom Egypt. Their story is carved in stone and pressed into clay, a civilization of profound contrasts. They were fierce warriors who built their empire through conquest, yet they are also remembered for something remarkable: one of the earliest known international peace treaties, the Treaty of Kadesh, negotiated with Pharaoh Rameses II after a monumental stalemate. Their capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of defensive engineering, a sprawling city of monumental stone gates, towering walls, and subterranean tunnels. But the true soul of the Hittites was preserved in their archives, thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets. These weren't just tax records. They contained everything from intricate legal codes and detailed historical annals to precise instructions for religious rituals, and even a haunting plague prayer, where a king begs the gods to end a pestilence, confessing, "We have done nothing." This was a literate, bureaucratic, and deeply religious state. They also held a technological secret that would define the next age: an early mastery of iron smelting, giving their armies a potential edge in a world of bronze. For centuries, they ruled a vast territory, a central anchor in the complex international system of the late Bronze Age. Then, around 1180 BCE, in the blink of an historical eye, it was all over. Hattusa, the impregnable capital, was not just conquered, it was meticulously burned, its palaces and temples set ablaze in a final, catastrophic inferno. The archives were left buried in the ashes, a time capsule for future archaeologists. The royal line vanished, the Hittite language used for court and ceremony ceased to be spoken. The empire shattered like a clay tablet dropped on stone. This collapse was not isolated. It was a central act in the wider drama of the Bronze Age collapse that also consumed the Mycenaeans and brought Egypt to its knees. So what force could topple such a formidable, organized power? The suspects are many, and they likely acted as a chorus of disaster. External invasion is the most dramatic suspect. Egyptian and other records from the time speak in terrified tones of the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of raiders who moved by ship and land, attacking coasts and overthrowing kingdoms. Were they the direct torchbearers who burned Hattusa? Possibly, but some scholars believe the Hittite heartland was too far inland for a seaborne force to be the sole culprit. Internal decay may have weakened the empire from within. The Hittite state was a federation of sometimes restless subject peoples. Years of poor harvests, possibly linked to the severe droughts that afflicted the region, could have sparked famines, leading to rebellions and a breakdown of central authority. A weakened Hittite realm would have been easy prey for any aggressor, whether the Sea Peoples or neighboring rivals like the Cahokians. The most plausible scenario is a devastating convergence. A series of crop failures triggers famine and social unrest, fragmenting the empire's cohesion. As internal rebellion flares, external raiders see their chance and strike at the weakened core. The capital falls in a storm of fire and violence. In the aftermath, the grand imperial structure was irreparable. The language of state and the cult of the great king died with Hattusa. However, fragments of Hittite culture persisted for a time in the form of smaller, so-called Neo-Hittite city-states in Syria like Carchemish. These carried on some artistic and linguistic traditions for a few centuries, but they were eventually swallowed one by the rising Assyrian war machine. The Hittites' end is a stark lesson in systemic fragility. It shows that even an empire of archives and iron, a nation of lawyers and soldiers, is not immune to a perfect storm. When the climate turns, the harvests fail, and the old alliances crumble. The flames can reach even the most fortified gates, leaving behind only baked clay tablets to whisper of laws, prayers, and a peace treaty that could not save them from the coming dark. The Hittite archives fell silent in fire, but another civilization story was written in water and whispered in myth. In the turquoise shallows of the Persian Gulf, the island of Bahrain was once the heart of a legendary trading empire. To the ancient Sumerians, this place was not just a port, it was Dilmun, a blessed paradise described in their epic poetry. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, Dilmun is a pure, bright land where the sun god Utu rises, a place of sweet waters and immortality where pain and sickness are unknown. This was more than fantasy, it was a cultural memory of a real, prosperous partner. For over 2,000 years, from around 3000 BCE, Dilmun was the essential middleman of the ancient world. Its merchants operated the vital maritime link between two colossal civilizations, Mesopotamia to the west and the Indus Valley to the east. Dilmun's ships, likely sturdy vessels built from the mangrove wood abundant in the Gulf, were floating warehouses. They carried Mesopotamian wool, textiles, and grain eastward, and returned laden with the coveted treasures of the Indus, copper from Oman, and perhaps most importantly, ivory, exotic woods, and precious stones from distant lands. The island itself was a lush oasis, fueled by abundant freshwater springs that bubbled up from underground aquifers, allowing for agriculture and supporting a sizable population. The wealth generated from this trade was not spent on towering pyramids or vast palaces, but on the afterlife. The landscape of Bahrain is still dotted with the physical evidence of Dilmun's prosperity, tens of thousands of ancient burial mounds. These are not simple graves, but elaborate chambered tombs often reused for generations, containing pottery, weapons, and seals that speak of a complex society with its own iconography and beliefs. For centuries, this system was perfectly balanced. Dilmun controlled the knowledge of the sea routes and the trust of both distant partners. Then, around 500 BCE, the world changed around them and Dilmun's purpose began to evaporate. The primary cause was a dramatic shift in the geography of trade. New, ambitious empires were rising, particularly the Achaemenid Persians, who unified a vast territory from the Indus to the Mediterranean. With this political unification came new, more efficient logistics. Why rely on a chain of middlemen when you could establish direct control? The Persians and later the Seleucids began to promote direct sea routes from their own ports in southern Iran and Mesopotamia straight to India, bypassing the Gulf archipelago entirely. At the same time, the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization centuries earlier had already removed one of Dilmun's two great trading partners. The new networks forming in the Indian Ocean made their once crucial role as an entrepot economically obsolete. The money simply stopped flowing through their harbors. What happens to a civilization whose entire identity and wealth are built on being the essential link when the chain is reforged to exclude them? Dilmun did not fall to a dramatic invasion or a natural disaster. It experienced a slow, inexorable fading. As its economic lifeblood drained away, its political independence withered. The once busy ports grew quiet. The distinctive Dilmun seals were no longer impressed on clay tablets. The culture lost its prominence and was gradually, peacefully absorbed by the larger political forces that now dominated the region, first the Babylonians, then the Persians, and later the Hellenistic kingdoms. The people of Dilmun likely remained, but their unique cultural signature dissolved into the broader tapestry of Gulf history. Their story is a powerful lesson in economic fragility. A civilization can be legendary, prosperous, and mythologized by its neighbors, yet its survival can hinge entirely on its place in a commercial network. When the map of trade is redrawn by greater powers, a paradise can become just another island, its greatness remembered only in old poems and in the silent, countless mounds that hold the bones of its merchants who once knew the secret paths between worlds. From the maritime trade of Dilmun, we move inland to a culture defined not by a city or an empire, but by a single, elegant object. Across the vast expanse of Europe, from the sun-baked coasts of Iberia to the forests of Central Europe, a shared artifact appears in ancient graves. It is a pot shaped like an inverted bell, decorated with bands of intricate geometric patterns. This is the bell beaker, and the people who made it represent one of prehistory's most fascinating puzzles. Beginning around 2800 BCE, these distinctive pots, along with a characteristic package of grave goods like archers' wrist guards, copper daggers, and distinctive V-perforated buttons, appear in burials across the continent. This was not an invading army leaving a trail of destruction, but a widespread cultural phenomenon that connected regions thousands of miles apart. For centuries, the bell beaker culture represented a new kind of network, one that spread revolutionary ideas. They were instrumental in disseminating the knowledge of metalworking, particularly copper and early bronze, across Western and Central Europe. Some linguists also propose they may have been the vectors for the earliest forms of Indo-European languages, the ancient root of tongues like English, Spanish, and Hindi, though this remains a hotly contested theory. What were they? A migrating people, a prestigious cult of elite warriors and metalworkers whose style was copied by local chiefs, or simply a powerful idea, a fashionable package of status symbols that spread through trade and imitation? Archaeology cannot yet give a definitive answer, and that is central to the mystery of their end, for the bell beaker culture did not disappear in a fire or a famine. Around 2000 BCE, its clear signature begins to fade. The characteristic pots are no longer placed in graves with the same consistency. The wrist guards and daggers evolve into new forms. But this is not a vanishing, it is a metamorphosis. The widespread bell beaker network gradually dissolved, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. Its most transformative elements, metalworking, new social hierarchies, perhaps even a new language, were not discarded. They were absorbed. In Central Europe, for example, the bell beaker tradition seamlessly flowed into the early Bronze Age Unetist culture, known for its sophisticated bronze axes and the earliest evidence of wheeled carts. The beaker-shaped pot evolved into different ceramic forms. The copper dagger was refined into a bronze sword. the network consolidated into more regionally distinct but technologically advanced societies. Their disappearance, therefore, challenges our very definition of the word. A culture that exists as a widespread set of symbols and technologies does not die when those symbols change. It evolves, its essence passing into the foundations of what comes next. The bell beaker phenomenon did not collapse. It was a catalyst, a river that fed into many smaller, stronger streams. Its end is invisible because it was never an ending at all, but a quiet, successful integration into the fabric of European prehistory, leaving us to wonder if the greatest legacy a culture can have is to become so fundamental that it is forgotten as a separate thing. The open ocean is the most formidable frontier on Earth, a trackless blue desert where a single mistake means oblivion. Yet, long before the Vikings or the great Chinese treasure fleets, one culture looked upon that endless horizon and saw not a barrier but a highway. This was the Lapita people, the fearless pioneers who undertook the most audacious human migration in history, the colonization of remote Oceania. Their story begins in the island chains of near Oceania, around the Bismarck archipelago, sometime before 1500 BCE. What drove them to launch their double-hulled canoes into the unknown? We may never know for certain, but the archaeological record leaves a beautiful, unmistakable trail. Their signature is a pottery of astonishing artistry. Lapita vessels are decorated with intricate geometric patterns stamped into the clay with delicate tooth tools, creating designs of faces, eyes, and labyrinthine motifs. Each pot is a fingerprint of their identity. Carrying these pots along with taro, yam, pigs, and chickens, they embarked on voyages of staggering distance and navigational genius. With no compasses, no charts, only their profound reading of stars, currents, bird flights, and cloud formations, they sailed east. Generation by generation, they discovered and settled a vast triangle of the Pacific, reaching the far-flung islands of Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. For centuries, this ceramic trail marks their presence, a dotted line of artistic brilliance across thousands of miles of ocean. Then, on most of these eastern islands, the pottery stops. The intricate stamped designs vanish from the archaeological record. So did the Lapita people disappear. In one sense, yes, their distinct material culture, that beautiful ceramic art, came to an end. But this is not a mystery of collapse or catastrophe. It is almost certainly a story of brilliant adaptation. Think of their voyage. Pottery is heavy, fragile, and requires specific clay sources and kilns. On long, perilous canoe journeys, every item had to justify its space and weight. The pots were essential, perhaps for storing precious water, fermenting food, or serving vital ritual purposes during the migration itself. But once they made landfall on a new, pristine island, their priorities shifted radically. In their new homes, they may have found that natural materials like gourds or woven baskets served their storage needs just as well, without the labor of finding clay and maintaining pottery traditions. More importantly, their culture was not static. Isolated on islands separated by vast seas, each community began to evolve in its own direction. The shared Lapita identity, symbolized by the pottery, gradually faded as new local identities formed. The Lapita did not vanish into thin air. They evolved. Their language, their seafaring knowledge, their social structures, and their descendants became the foundation for the entire Polynesian world. They are the direct ancestors of the Maori, the Hawaiians, the Tahitians, and the Rapa Nui. The intricate tattoos of Polynesia, the complex social hierarchies, the epic navigation chants, all carry echoes of the Lapita legacy. Their disappearance, therefore, is the most successful kind. They vanished not by dying out, but by giving birth to an entire family of vibrant new cultures, transforming themselves so completely that their original name was lost to time, remembered only by the fragments of their stunning pottery, scattered like breadcrumbs across the greatest journey humans have ever undertaken. The Pacific voyagers vanished by becoming something new, but on the high plains of the Andes, a different empire fell because the sky itself turned against it. In the thin air beside Lake Titicaca, at an altitude where most crops refused to grow, the Tiwanaku Empire performed an agricultural miracle. From around 500 to 1000 CE, they transformed the harsh Altiplano into a breadbasket, supporting a capital city that was a marvel of spiritual and political power. The heart of their world was the city of Tiwanaku itself, a ceremonial and urban center of staggering ambition. Here, they erected monuments that seemed to defy both gravity and understanding. The most iconic is the Gate of the Sun, a massive stone portal carved from a single block of andesite. At its center stands the enigmatic staff god, a figure holding a staff in each hand, surrounded by 48 winged attendants that seem to be running toward him, a celestial calendar frozen in stone. Nearby, the Akapana Pyramid rose as a terraced earth mound, likely designed to channel rainwater in a sacred display of hydraulic engineering. But their true genius was not in stone alone, it was in the mud of the lakeshore. To feed a population that may have reached tens of thousands, Tiwanaku engineers created a system of raised field agriculture, or suka kolas. They dug a network of canals and used the excavated soil to build long, raised planting beds. The canals performed multiple miracles. They trapped heat from the sun, creating a microclimate that protected crops from the frequent frosts of the high altitude. They provided irrigation during dry spells and drainage during rains. Aquatic plants in the canals fixed nutrients, creating a natural fertilizer that could be added to the beds. This sustainable, intensive system produced bumper harvests of potatoes, quinoa, and other tubers year after year, fueling the empire's growth and allowing it to project influence across the southern Andes. For 5 centuries, this delicate balance between human ingenuity and a demanding environment held. Then, around the year 1000, it all unraveled. The great city was abandoned, its monuments left to the wind, its political authority dissolved. What could break a society so brilliantly adapted to its home? The evidence, read from the mud at the bottom of Lake Titicaca and from ancient ice cores, points to a single, relentless enemy, drought. Not a bad season or two, but a mega-drought that gripped the region for decades, possibly even a full century. Imagine the canals, those life-giving veins of the empire, slowly drying up. The protective microclimate would have failed, leaving crops exposed to killing frosts. The water table would have dropped, and the lake itself likely receded. Their entire agricultural foundation, the very source of their surplus and their power, crumbled into dust. Famine would have been widespread and inescapable. In such a crisis, faith in the ruling elite and the staff god who guaranteed the seasons would have evaporated faster than the lake water. This environmental catastrophe almost certainly ignited social and political explosions. The finely tuned system of labor and resource distribution that built the monuments and maintained the fields would have broken down. Different groups within the empire or outlying provinces likely turned on each other in a desperate competition for the dwindling food supplies. The capital, dependent on tribute from a vast network, would have found its supplies cut off. The result was not a foreign conquest, but a systemic collapse from within. The urban center of Tiwanaku was gradually depopulated, its people dispersing in a great diaspora across the Andes, carrying their knowledge and traditions with them. They did not vanish from the earth. Their legacy lived on in the raised field techniques later adopted by other cultures, and their religious iconography, like the staff god, may have echoed in the cosmology of the mighty Inca who rose centuries later. The empty Gate of the Sun stands as a stark monument to a profound truth, that even the most ingenious human systems are held in a fragile covenant with the climate, and when the rain decides not to come, even gods carved in stone cannot hold a civilization together. The fate of the Tiwanaku, scattered by drought, reminds us that survival sometimes means letting go of a singular identity. this same human truth echoes in a more recent and deeply personal mystery that bridges our journey from the ancient world to the edge of the modern one. It is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, a vanishing act so close to our own historical doorstep that its unanswered question feels almost intimate. In 1587, a group of 115 English men, women, and children landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their governor, John White, soon sailed back to England for desperately needed supplies. War with Spain delayed his return for 3 long years. When he finally made it back in 1590, he found the settlement utterly empty. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed. There were no signs of struggle, no graves, and no cross, the pre-arranged signal for distress. The only clue was a single word carved into a fort post, Croatoan, and the letters Zero carved into a nearby tree. The entire community had simply evaporated. This was not the collapse of a millennia-old empire, but the disappearance of a single generation of families with names and faces, leaving behind a 400-year-old cold case that continues to haunt the American imagination. So what really happened to them? The most logical and compelling theory is not one of mass death, but of deliberate disintegration. The word Croatoan was not a cryptic message, it was likely a straightforward destination. The Croatoan were a friendly Native American tribe living on a nearby island, now known as Hatteras. Governor White himself noted the carving was not hastily scratched but neatly inscribed. This suggests a planned move, not a panicked flight. The colonists, facing starvation and isolation after 3 winters without resupply, would have been in desperate straits. Their only viable path to survival was to seek help from the people who knew the land. The leading theory, supported by later English accounts and oral histories, is that the colonists split up. Some may have gone to live with the Croatoan people. Others may have traveled further inland, seeking shelter with other Algonquian-speaking groups. In doing so, they would have made a conscious, pragmatic choice to stop being an English colony. They would have adopted native clothing, learned new languages, intermarried, and integrated fully into the social and kinship networks of their hosts. Their disappearance as a distinct European entity was therefore an act of assimilation for the sake of life itself. Later, in the early 17th century, Jamestown settlers heard persistent rumors from various native sources about people who looked like Englishmen living in villages to the south. Some reports spoke of 2-story stone houses, others of natives with gray eyes, or of a chief who spoke English and claimed his ancestors could talk from a book. While these stories are tantalizing, no definitive archaeological evidence has ever concretely linked later native sites to the lost colonists. The forest and the tides have kept their secret. The power of the Roanoke story lies in its haunting ambiguity. It represents the moment the vast, unknown continent swallowed a European outpost whole, not with violence but with silence. It forces us to consider that the most enduring mysteries are not always about catastrophe, but about choice. Those 115 people faced an impossible decision: hold onto their identity and perish, or let it go and live. The single word carved on the post suggests they chose life, walking away from their old world to become part of a new one, leaving behind only their unanswered name to whisper across the centuries. From the intimate mystery of Roanoke to the silent pyramids of Kush, these 30 vanishings are not random tragedies, but profound lessons etched into the landscape of time. Though each story is unique, certain haunting patterns emerge like ghostly fingerprints on history. The most relentless force is environmental catastrophe. We saw it in the megadrought that emptied the cliff cities of the ancestral Pueblones, in the volcanic fury that shattered the Minoan world, and in the shifting monsoons that unraveled the Khmer's hydraulic empire. A civilization can master stone and steel, but it remains forever at the mercy of the sky and the soil. Economic fragility is another common thread. The Nabateans faded when trade bypassed their desert capital. Dilmun became a forgotten paradise when new sea routes made its middlemen obsolete. A culture built on commerce can vanish when the money stops flowing, leaving its grandest monuments as empty marketplaces. Social and political upheaval from within often delivers the final blow. The classic Maya's warfare and rigid hierarchy, the Moch's shattered faith in their priest-kings, the Cucuteni Tripilia's enigmatic ritual burnings, all speak of societies where internal strain, amplified by external pressure, caused the center to collapse. Yet, perhaps the most important pattern is also the most hopeful. True extinction is rare. More often, these cultures did not die out, they transformed. The Yuezhi became the Kushans. The ancestral Pueblones are the ancestors of modern Hopi and Zuni. The Dorset may have been absorbed by the Thule, and the Roanoke colonists likely chose to live by blending into a new world. The people endured even when their political unity, their artistic traditions, or their name did not. These stories remind us that civilizations are not monoliths, but fragile compacts between people and their environment, between rulers and the ruled, between tradition and change. When that delicate balance breaks, a world can dissolve, leaving behind only echoes in stone, whispers in myth, and questions that pull us across centuries. So we are left to wonder, which of these great vanishings speaks most powerfully to you? Does the silent script of the Indus Valley haunt your thoughts, or the defiant retreat of the Torona into their mountain sanctuary? Share your theories and your fascination in the comments below. The conversation about these lost worlds is part of keeping their mystery alive. If you want to join more journeys into the hidden corners of history, be sure to subscribe.